Good evening. My name is James Davis, and this evening we will be running through a webinar that is about rent arrears. I've been a landlord for the past 16 years, and I've been letting out properties in northwest London and in Swansea. And it was off the back of that I decided to become the CEO of Upad for Landlords and set up a business that allowed landlords to self-serve and do things in a smarter way, in my mind, than what could have been done before. So I'd like to say thank you very much for everybody for joining this evening's webinar. I'm joined today by Ben from Simple Insurance. Ben, thank you very much for taking part and joining us this evening. Good evening to you.
No problem, no problem. Good evening.
Thank you very much, and also welcome to members of the RLA that have also joined us this evening. You're very welcome, and thank you very much for joining. For those that haven't attended a webinar in the past, the way this will work is that I will run through some slides that you will be able to see on your computer. You can hear me and Ben, but we can't hear you. But what you can do is participate by asking questions through the panel you have on the right-hand side of your screen. And what you can see is a chat box. And any questions you would like to put to Ben and myself at the end of the webinar, we will be glad to answer them then. But please do put any comments there that you would like. If you have any issues you would also like us to talk about during the webinar, we will try and answer them whilst we are doing this webinar. We're going to try and make it as interactive as possible. There's 3 or 4 polls that we'll be running, so we'd really like to have some input from yourselves. And I think just finally, hopefully it will be really insightful. Please make plenty of notes as we run through the presentation. And hopefully for the RLA members and Simple Landlord Insurance customers, there will be some really useful tips here on how you can avoid rent arrears. So going back to the slide deck, Upad in the last 12 months has let just over 9,500 properties. But the most interesting thing from my perspective is the amount of inquiries we've received from tenants, which has gone over the 250,000 mark in the last 12 months. And for me, this gives us some insights into tenant behaviour, what tenants are looking for, what's making their property stand out online, and so on and so forth. But one of the key things that we've picked up on in the last year or so is the amount of arrears, etc., that that landlords seem to be sort of falling into, and that's why we thought it'd be useful to run a series of webinars about rent arrears and basically how you can avoid getting into that that issue in the first place. So I would just like to start this evening by doing a quick poll of what kind of landlord are you. So on the poll box that's in front of you, can you select one of the 5 options of whether you're thinking about becoming a landlord, you're fairly new to it, or you've got quite a few properties, or the other end of the ladder where you've been doing it for quite some time, and you know exactly what you're doing. And if you can select one of those buttons and then press the submit option, that will be absolutely fantastic. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to do that. Let's bring up the results just to see where we've got everybody in the room. So it's actually quite a nice balance of people in the room, actually. It sort of follows what the national average is in terms of the fact of people that have got a couple or got quite a few. So really interesting to see that we've got a good mixture of people that are taking part. So in the next 30 minutes or so, what Ben and I are going to run through is why there's been an increase in rent arrears, whether, just the fact of issuing Section 8 or Section 21, it's final. Once you've done it, there's no sort of going backwards. So what precautions you should take before finally issuing it. We're going to talk briefly about what a Section 8 is or a Section 21, and what happens next once you've issued one of these notices. And just finally, I'm going to end up with measures that we can all put into play as landlords to identify those risks, so we can minimise having to issue a Section 8 during the course of a tenancy agreement. The one thing I do want to just mention on behalf of Ben and myself is we're not going to answer any specific questions about a case you may actually have. I think it's unfair to other people in the room, and I think it's better to sort of deal with sort of case-by-case things on a one-on-one basis. But we're going to try and keep them general, but do please post your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side where we will cover them off as efficiently as we possibly can. So I mentioned earlier about the fact that so many landlords have had rent arrears in the last 12 months. I just think it'd be interesting for those people in the room, if you can select one of these 3 options about whether you've had rent arrears or not in the last 12 months, or whether it's not applicable because you're not a landlord or you're not involved on the day-to-day bit of it all, because it'd be really interesting to see what we have in terms of people listening and what part of it you fall into. So hopefully everyone's had a chance to select one of those options. Let's bring up the results. So most of you, 53% in the last 12 months. So that's really, really interesting. And the reason I mentioned that is just going back to the slide deck. First of all, there's been a massive growth in the amount of claims by us as landlords for rent arrears. And in the whole of 2003, so sort of 18 months ago or so, there were 70,000 claims during the whole year. But in the first quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year, there was approximately 47,000 claims being made. So there's been a really big increase in the last couple of years. And my view is this is a problem for pretty much all landlords at some point. But the UK average is that 40% of landlords have faced arrears, and the fact we had sort of over 50% for everybody in the room here says that hopefully this webinar will be really, really useful, and you know, maybe in 12 months' time we should reconvene to see whether we've brought that down based on what we're going to run through in the next 25 minutes or so. I think one of the key reasons why there have been more rent arrears in the last 12 months compared to the year before is that the percentage of people's take-home pay that is being spent on rent has been gradually increasing. You know, people's pay has not been increasing, but what has been happening to rent has been a steady 5 to 10% increase year on year. And so therefore, the percentage that people spend on rent has therefore been increasing. One thing we've noticed with companies like the National Deadline Service is last year they received just over 20,000 calls for people from help in rent arrears compared to 2007 where it was 8,000. So you know, it's 150% increase. And I think this bit of people's salaries not matching up with the growth of rents is a key factor, as well as people's financial commitments have been growing. One, I think, quite scary statistic is unsecured debt in the UK, and this is the average figure for an average household, has grown about 10% to about £9,000. And obviously unsecured debt relates to loans, credit cards, etc. But to say the average household has £9,000 of unsecured debt, and the fact there's been a sort of a 10% growth year on year, is a really big factor. And isn't helping why rent arrears have been gradually increasing. So I think that's why we're in this situation, and why doing webinars with Simple Insurance and the RLA certainly sort of makes sense. Before you issue a Section 8 or indeed a Section 21 to do with rent arrears, I think one thing all of us as landlords should do is identify the warning signs and the risks when we're letting out our property. And a few things I've just sort of put together is if there's been a lack of communication, or if the tenants are not giving us access to the property. These things can be really interesting to know that actually something's up, and why has there been a change, and it should set off an alarm bell in your own mind. If tenants have started paying rent sporadically, it used to be on actual rent day, but then it's 2 days late, and then 4 days late, and then 3 days late. There's something weird going on there, and it should send an alarm bell in your mind about things. Whether there's been a change in circumstances, people's employment's changing, whether they want the rent is coming from a different bank account, one of them has split up from their girlfriend or boyfriend, or if there's 3 people sharing, one of them has moved out. These could be absolutely okay, but they could also be an alarm bell, and we should think about it. And finally, tenants have an issue of or a stance of making complaints all of a sudden, and actually then not paying the rent afterwards. So if all of a sudden your tenant's starting to make complaints or bring up issues to do with the property, it could be a warning sign, and you should sort of consider all of these things. But before we talk about issuing a notice, things that we should be aware of, I think, before we physically sort of go down that particular route. And I think we should look at the probability of each of these risks occurring, I suppose. So first of all, you know, when you do issue a Section 8, the relationship that you have with your tenants is more than likely going to break down. They might not stop looking after the property, they may stop paying the rents at all, and you should just consider the factors. If it's a question that rent is being paid maybe 1 or 2 days late every month, I don't think it's advantageous for us to start saying, look, if this continues, I'm going to issue you with a Section 8, because, and then fulfill on it, because we might be causing more issues that we've got. And just look at the probability factor of, will these tenants actually stop paying me the rent, or is it just the fact they're just not on the ball, and maybe we should live with those sorts of things. And I think stuff like that is particularly worthwhile. The other bit is they may not have the ability to pay the market rent anymore. Maybe they don't have, you know, the same job, and therefore maybe we should be happy to accept 90% of what the rent is, rather than go through the issue of raising a Section 8 and the issues that then come with it. And I'll come on to what's involved with issuing a Section 8 or 21 in a second. But we should just look at the whole situation rather than just rushing into it. And I suppose assess the impact based on whether there's a low risk or a high risk of one of these things actually happening. Because you know, you can be getting yourself into more trouble. They may just stop paying the rent completely, or actually it may not be an issue in any way, shape, or form. So we should spend a bit of time before we start threatening or issuing a Section 8 of evaluating the risk rather than just sort of jumping into it all. And the key reason I say this is I'm a real believer that we should try and reach, where possible, an amicable solution. And the reason I say this is that, as we'll see in a second, the time for issuing a Section 8 and actually evicting a tenant and the cost is actually quite a long period of time and quite an expensive one. And therefore, where possible, we should try and park emotions. We appreciate that these are properties that we own. We probably have an emotional attachment to them, but we should probably park those things and try and reach an amicable solution. And sort of this view of trying to sort of go through arbitration and just talk to try and reach a common goal, rather than just going, look, you've got to pay the rent. If you don't, you issue a Section 8. I think in my mind it's wrong to be quite so black and white, because I think the second you do issue one of these notices, the relationship changes generally for the worst, and you could be in a worse period of time. So do sort of park emotions where possible and act business-like, and use the idea of issuing a Section 8 as a sort of a final warning. You know, your last result that you've got available should anything sort of go wrong. So I just briefly want to mention what a Section 8 is and what a Section 21 is. And for those of you know that don't know, but I'm only talking about rent arrears here, and clearly Section 21s and Section 8s have other purposes as well, but tonight we're just talking about rent arrears. I want to stay focused on it. So the reason you would issue a Section 8 is for you to get possession back of your property if there have been rent arrears. And when I put on there about missing 2 monthly payments, what that means is the fact they could be 1 month and a day behind on their rent, and that is in effect 2 months rent payments. So that is the first time you can issue a Section 8 when tenants are behind. And Section 21, and again we're just talking about rent arrears, is at the end of the fixed term of the property, if you want to get possession back, as long as you've complied with all the other sort of information. But again, I'm just talking about rent arrears and the two, I suppose, vehicles we have for getting tenants to move out, should that be the case. What I just want to talk about next is what needs to happen when you've decided to issue a Section 8. And some of these things are quite important. The first is serving the correct notice and the correct information, because if this goes to court, it will get thrown out if you haven't supplied the right information and the right prescribed information to tenants. I think it's also worth noting that it can be a criminal offence to evict a tenant if you haven't got a court order for possession. So we shouldn't be taking matters into our own hands and sort of bypassing what the law says, because actually it can come back and haunt you in a very big way. And you need to be able to prove to the courts that you've sent the right information at the right time, which is why I'm a really big believer that if you're going to issue a Section 8 or 21, that you use a professional rather than trying to do it yourself. There's various tools online that you can do for downloading your own Section 8, which is very easy, it's very cost effective, but I actually think it can create a bigger can of worms where actually you can get to court, it gets thrown out of court, or something of similar lines. And I'm a big fan of using sites like the NLA has got a repossession service. There's obviously a few others out there. This would be one that I recommend, of just to put it in the hands of a professional rather than trying to do it yourself, because there's so many things that can go wrong that should it come to actually issuing a Section 8 or 21, I would give it to a professional. I'm a really big believer of that, otherwise things can go very, very wrong. What I want to show you now is a sort of a timeline of once you issue a Section 8 or 21 of then what happens next. And just sort of digest what I've put up on the screen here. And the key reason being is that if we're going to issue a Section 8 or a 21, what I've been talking about so far about we should think about what other actions we can do beforehand, can we try and reach an amicable solution? Because this can very easily become a sort of a 5-month process from start to finish. It can cost a few thousand pounds, and I don't think we should just rush into the idea of downloading a Section 8. You know, tenants are 5 days late in paying their rent for the second time. That's unacceptable, and go through this journey. It can really work against us, and we should look at the bigger picture. One company that Upad also works with is called Landlord Action. From their statistics are that 60-odd% of tenants actually vacate at the end of the 2 months from issuing a Section 21. So most of the time, tenants do leave, but it can very easily take a 5-month journey. And so rather than getting yourself into this situation that can be very costly, stressful and time-consuming, I'd like to run through some sort of top tips, I guess, of what us as landlords can do to prevent going through this journey, not at all costs, but as many costs as we possibly can. But just before we do that, I'd like to do a very quick poll of just to get an idea of what would you do if your tenant goes into arrears tomorrow. From what we've sort of said first time, would you try and go for the amicable solution, or do you think just issuing a Section 8 is the right thing to do, and hope that sort of, I suppose, all sort of sorts itself out in the long run? So if you can select one of those options, that would be much appreciated. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to do that, and then we'll just bring up the results. Thank you very much. So try and reach an amicable solution. So brilliant. Whether this is something you were going to do anyway, or whether it's what we've sort of talked about so far, I'm sort of indifferent about. I'm just really, honestly, very pleased that everybody that's listening in this evening is going to go down the route of trying to reach an amicable solution where possible. It's very much a favourable position from my perspective. So just to run through some advice, and I think these would be very useful comments to scribble down on a pad of paper if you've got that to hand, is to ask some questions prior to the viewing. So when you have got tenants calling you to organise a viewing, it may be worth asking them some sensible questions, and which we'll come on to in a second. Maybe ask some different questions actually at the viewing. I'm a believer about tenant referencing, getting sort of your previous landlord's reference, employer's reference, and I'm also a very big fan of active management, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean on that. But one thing that I think is worth really mentioning is, as a landlord, we have a real luxury. We actually can choose who is moving into our property, and I think by following some of the steps that we're going to talk about in a second, the vast majority of issues relating to tenants can actually be eliminated by taking this advice and actually ensuring we've got good tenants in our property, because I think it's better to actually have a vacant property than to have a bad tenant in there. We will be emailing a guide, or we should be able to get in a second anyway, of what this sort of all consists of. But just to sort of run through what I mean, is that when you've got tenants calling you, whether you're using Upad or some other service for finding tenants, ask them when they're calling you, is what would your current landlord say about you? Would they give you a good reference? Why are you looking to move? Where you work and how long you've been there for? And do you know the basic understanding about the property? And the reason I say these 4 key questions is it's all about de-risking. And what I suggest is to create a little spreadsheet, and for each tenant that is contacting you, David, Michael, Michelle, is to put next to each of their names what their responses have been, the same actually at a viewing, and so at the time that maybe 2 or 3 offers come through, you can make an informed decision about what's being said over the phone at a viewing and what offer they've made and your gut feel of them, rather than sort of rushing into it. And the reason why I say, what would your landlord say about you, where do you work, is how somebody responds is probably worth 1,000 times more than just filling it out on a form. And whether they stutter or whether they just get on with it will be really, really insightful. The same goes with actually at a viewing. If you ask somebody what is your take-home pay, whether they just come out with a figure of £1,650, that's probably the right figure. But if they start stuttering or going around £2,000 a month, it should set an alarm bell off in your mind about whether this is somebody I want to trust with my asset. That is basically my pension fund. So consider those things, and it's the same with these other questions that I sort of put up on here. How they react to these questions is really, really, really important. And just before I do another poll, one thing I'm also quite a big fan of is physically doing the viewing myself, and there's a couple of reasons. The first is this due diligence of asking questions like this rather than a tenant just filling out a form is, for me, exceptionally invaluable. It will say so much about what that person is actually like rather than just relying on what they say on a form, and so there's huge value there. And secondly, we did a survey amongst about 25,000 tenants, and the overwhelming majority of them wanted to meet you, the landlord, on a viewing. So if you can put that in your advert that you're doing the viewing, you're going to appeal to the vast majority of tenants that want to have a relationship with you, as it were, and it allows you to do this due diligence. So off the back of that, it'd be interesting to know currently of how many people do their own viewings. If you can select one of these options that applies to you, that would be really, really helpful, whether you try and do it or maybe some of your properties aren't near where you live and therefore you rely on somebody else. So that would be really, really helpful. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to select one of the options that works for them. If I just bring up the results. So quite an even split, but overall, I suppose the majority of people are doing their own views, which is fantastic. It's really great to hear, and I think I suppose one thing I guess I'm a bit surprised about is when we've done webinars like this to the Upad base and to other spaces where landlords self-serve, I sort of expect most people do their own viewings. But I think it's quite interesting, given that the vast majority of people listening in this evening have used Simple Insurance to take out insurance, but clearly quite a lot of Simple's customer base seem to self-serve, which is a really interesting thing. So moving on, tenant referencing is also really important. We should consider doing a credit check, the previous landlord, and the employer's reference. And I think this is really helpful just to build up the understanding. Yes, ask the proper questions at a viewing, but also to see it in a black and white, I think goes very well and sort of dovetails with this, and I think it's very useful to take into account. I would also suggest that for a few reasons that we should consider taking out rent guarantee insurance, and I think there's probably a couple of reasons why I say this. Is that for sort of just over £100 a year, we as landlords can take out a policy that could protect us should there ever be an issue with our tenants. And I might ask Ben in a second whether he's got anything to sort of add on this bit, but the fact that the cost in relation to what it delivers is becomes so cost effective compared to where these things were a few years ago. And I suppose that peace of mind factor that it buys us, that should there be an issue, I'm protected for a relatively low cost, is something that might be worth sort of considering. Ben, I don't know whether you've got anything you want to add at this stage, and I'm certainly not putting you on the spot if you don't want to, but is there anything you just wanted to add at this point?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, for as little as sort of, you know, 45, 50 pounds a year, you can cover any lost rent for, you know, up to 6 months, you know, depending on kind of how much you charge your tenants. So it's a good safety net to have, if you know, if that should happen.
No, indeed. And I think because of the cost effectiveness of it compared to how it may have been a few years ago, I think it's something that we should actively be sort of considering, I guess, when we are being a landlord. And then the final bit I wanted to mention was the idea about active management. And what I mean by this, and it's hard to put my finger on what it means, but it's just not being passive and just letting things happen. It's keeping track of when rent day is, putting a date in your diary, maybe sending an SMS or an email to the tenants the day before to say your rent is due tomorrow. If they are in arrears, you know, if rent day was today and you haven't had anything through yet, to call them or SMS them on the same day. Ultimately, to sort of develop, I guess, a platform that allows you to communicate with your tenants. And whether this is calling them or SMS or email, I don't think it really necessarily matters, but just have a platform whereby if there's ever any issues with your property, your tenants are able to call you and you're approachable and sympathetic to them, and vice versa. It's really important in my mind to have that as a platform for people to talk, because otherwise, if there is an issue, it's very easy for people to sort of, I guess, hide behind you know, what's actually going on. And I think if you can try and be open and have an approach where people can easily talk to you through SMS or whatever it may be, is worthwhile. And I guess try and meet up from time to time. Try and understand your tenants. You know, you want to know what they're going through, whether, you know, one of them may be splitting up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. One of the 3 sharers has got, you know, an issue with their job or wants to go travelling, whatever it may be. But try and understand them and try and, you know, get under the skin a bit of what's going on and actively manage your property portfolio. Rather than just being passive and put your head in the sand and, you know, only start intervening when they're sort of 2 or 3 months in arrears. You're then creating a can of worms for yourself. And I'm a real believer that active management is helpful for us as landlords. Just looking forward, Upad, for those of you that haven't used us, is an online lettings agency. Whilst we charge £99 plus VAT to advertise your property across Rightmove, Zoopla, and a whole host of other sites, we do a huge amount of content, whether it's sites like this, whether it's things like this in terms of webinars. We do quite a lot of talks around the country. We have a newsletter, a very active blog, and we have a team that is available sort of 8 to 8 during the week and 9 to 4 on the weekends that are ALA accredited to deal with any queries. And we try and help landlords as much as we can mitigate against getting a bad tenant, minimising any void periods you have. And there was an interesting research study that came out that Upad landlords have 40% less arrears than the UK average. So hopefully these sort of webinars and other forums that we have been helpful to educate and share our experiences of what can really work. There's a huge amount of advice that we've got available sort of, you know, online, on email, over the phone, and a lot of this actually does start with having a professional relationship with your tenant, but also meeting them at the viewing. You know, what I mentioned earlier about most tenants wanting to meet us, and also you being able to do your due diligence and get that gut feel of who your tenants are is really, really important. And I suppose we actively encourage tenants, landlords to reference their tenants. And I think the balance of all of that helps mitigate the risks. After this webinar, there's a newsletter that we've got that you can register for, which has got a load of really useful bits of information, etc. But just to sort of summarise before we do any questions, and it's not too late if you want to send any questions through to us. There's the chat box on the right-hand side, and you can literally just post any questions you would like through to us, and we will try and answer as many as we can. But just to summarise, whilst anybody who still wants to ask a question does so, I think it's very important that rent arrears has becoming increasingly more commonplace. You know, the average is sort of 40% across the UK. You know, it's 50% for everybody in the room at the moment. I think it's a given it's going to happen. It's just a question of when. And I think we should, as landlords, try and put as many steps into place to prevent it from occurring to us for as long as we possibly can. Try and identify the risks before you issue a Section 8 or 21. You know, it's very much a final thing when you issue these things. The relationship generally changes quite dramatically. So try and have gone through every other option you've got to reach a sort of an amicable solution rather than sort of rushing into things. But if you do issue a Section 8, please take my advice and get some proper advice and use somebody to help you issue it to ensure that you're being compliant. Otherwise, these things can come back and be a lot worse for you in the long run. And just again, be aware of the time frames. You know, it can easily take 5 months, even sometimes more, to run through the whole process, which is ridiculous in my mind. But just be aware of that by issuing Section 8, you could be facing, you know, nobody paying you rent for 5 or 6 months, damage to your property. It may be something we have to do, but just be aware you're making a calculated decision before issuing it. And just, you know, try and put as many measures in place to identify those risks. Be actively involved, ask the right questions, you know, be on top of when rent is due, etc., so that you can prevent this from happening to you as much as you possibly can. And I'm a believer that most issues to do with tenants can actually be eliminated by being actively involved and not putting our head in the sand, I guess, on the situation. Now, we're going to try and do something that I think is very clever. I don't know whether it's going to work or not, but we've got a handout that sort of runs through a lot of what we've just talked about. That we're going to see if we can physically hand out, well, not physically, virtually hand out during this webinar. So let's see if we can make this all happen. While we do this, it's a sort of a new feature. It may not work, and if it doesn't, we'll just email it. But let's just see if it can work, because it'd be quite cool if we can. But if it doesn't, brilliant. So hopefully that's all come through, and everyone's had a chance to sort of download that guide that's come through. If it hasn't for whatever reason, we can send it to you later on. But on your taskbar on the right-hand side, one of the tabs is handouts, and there's 2 guides about how to choose the right tenants and what Upad offers that you can download. They will be there until the end of this webinar. If you've got any, if you want to download them and read at your leisure. I can't believe that's worked. It seems quite cool. That sounds really, really fantastic. So that just allows us to move on to doing some questions. So we've got like sort of 10 minutes or so left before we need to sort of wrap up, as it were. So of some of the sort of the questions that have come through from you this evening, and just run through some of these in order, is do you reference DSS tenants? So you can reference anybody, but I think just put into perspective, when you reference somebody, it consists of 3 parts: the previous landlord, the employer, and a credit check. Somebody on housing benefits is unlikely to be employed. They may not have a previous landlord, and credit-wise, they may not have a footprint in terms of on the electoral roll, credit cards, and those sort of things. And so, of course, you can reference them, but it may be the case that nothing really comes back if they haven't rented before, if they haven't got much of a credit history, and they're not employed. Ben, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, or whether you think that answers that question sufficiently.
Yeah, I mean, I think most, well, some insurers would, they might cover people that are claiming DSS benefits, but they'd have to have referenced satisfactorily, and you know, to have had a guarantor who's passed a similar kind of reference check. That's the only thing I'd add to that, really.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Next question that's come through, people asking how do you go about doing a credit check. So if you're using Upad to find tenants, we offer a referencing service where for £75 we will fully reference your tenants. What you get for that is the credit score, the previous landlord and the employer's reference, but we also actively manage the process throughout, and we will send you and the tenant an update of where you are in the process when we've had information back, so you know what's going on rather than being in the dark, as it were. So that's how credit checking to referencing works at Upad. Ben, we've had a question in where somebody's asking about rent guarantee insurance and what does it sort of cover. You're probably better qualified to answer this than myself.
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah, so basically it's, you know, in the event that a landlord's let down, and, you know, subject to the terms and conditions of the individual insurer, then the policy would cover the period of unpaid rental income. So also a lot of the time alongside that policy there is a sort of legal expenses cover. So that covers the cost of any legal proceedings which are involved in, for example, an eviction. So yeah, that basically will pay a landlord's legal and professional fees while they're seeking the eviction of that tenant.
Cool. Thank you very much, Ben. Another question that's come in, and it's been said sort of 4 times slightly differently, is what's sort of a reasonable amount of time before you start chasing tenants up if they're late with their rent? I think there's 2 bits that I think are worth looking at here. And again, you don't want to be over keen, and also you don't want to go from having somebody in situ for 6 months and then, you know, not being actively involved and all of a sudden going mad, if you know what I mean. So what I think makes sense from the beginning of a relationship, as soon as tenants have moved in, is that maybe on the the day before the first rent is due, so they've been in the property for just under a month, is maybe to send them a reminder the day before or a couple of days before that rent is due on Tuesday or whatever it may be, and maybe do that for the first couple of months as a gentle sort of reminder. Then that should probably suffice. And then if they are ever late with their rent, I think, emailing or SMSing at the back end of the day that rent is due or the following day is acceptable. I think if it's not cleared in your account by 9 AM of rent day, that's probably being a bit sort of overly cautious, I guess, and sort of being a bit too keen on the situation. So I think it's worth giving it a bit of space and not driving them too mad. And 9 times out of 10, probably even more actually, I find it's generally down to the fact that they've just forgotten, or they've just been busy, or they're away with work, or whatever it may be. And actually, it should serve as a sort of as a gentle reminder. And I think it's useful to sort of have that mindset. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Don't think that that they're actively choosing to not pay it. I think it's very important that you take the sort of stance that they just may have forgotten, rather than thinking they've actually done malice, as it were. I think it's very important to bear that bit in mind, rather than assume they're done something wrong right from the very, very, very beginning. So I would go down that particular bit. A couple of other questions have come in about what type of tenant referencing is needed if you want to take out rent guarantee insurance. Ben, can I pass that one over to you? I'm happy to answer anything else afterwards, but it's probably better off for you to answer that.
Yep, sure. So basically, what the checks would ask for is like a full 3-year credit history check, an alias name check to see if they go by any other names, a bank account verification, they would check the references of previous landlords and an employer's reference, and it would also include a check to verify that the income they said they receive is correct, and an identity check as well. I mean, it's possible for landlords to do the checks themselves, but I think that can be quite costly. So in a lot of cases, a lot of landlords tend to opt for a tenant referencing agency instead.
No, that all makes sense. Thank you very much, Ben. A couple of people saying, what if my tenants would like to pay their rent in cash rather than standing order? Look, at the end of the day, you have to declare your income. Obviously, you'll offset your costs when you're doing your tax return annually. And so I would recommend you get them to pay by standing order or direct debit, rather than having the issue of collecting cash and then paying it to your bank and what have you. You know, the HMRC has made noises about trying to clamp down on landlords because they've realised there's more of us renting out more properties. That said, they are very, very understaffed. But I think for ease and being above board, I would ask tenants to pay you straight into your bank account. It's a lot easier than sort of going down the other risk. A couple of people coming through about, whilst there's obviously been an increase in rent arrears, do you think the rental market is still really busy, buoyant, those sort of wordings? It's a really interesting point, actually, and I think both are interlinked. And what I mean by that is there's been quite a major increase in the amount of tenants looking for a new rental property. There's a lot of growth as more people have been forced into the rental market and to be in it for a longer period of time. What that means, therefore, is that the quality of tenants that range has also grown quite dramatically, and therefore, let's just say there's 5 people that put an offer in on your property. They're not all going to be high-quality tenants. Some may not be able to afford it, etc., etc. And therefore, I think because there's more people looking for a property and there's increased demand, whilst that is obviously fantastic at face value for us, the reality is I think there's an actual burden on us to do more due diligence to ensure that the person we choose to move into our property is a good guy who can afford the rent, who's going to look after it as a home, and ideally stay for a long period of time. So I think there's extra work on us to ensure that can happen. A couple of people talking about, again, about rent guarantee insurance. What happens if somebody's a student or they have adverse credit, you know, like a CCJ, for example, or something like that? Ben, you're probably the right man to answer on this one.
Hi. Yeah. I mean, students and people on DSS, again, what would be needed there would for them to have passed a reference satisfactorily, or again to be guaranteed by somebody else who also has passed a reference check. Yeah, so it's students the same with DSS benefits.
Fine. Okay. Thank you very much, Ben. I think we've got time just for sort of 1 or 2 more questions. I'll just try and pick a couple out. There's actually been quite a lot this evening, so maybe what we'll try and do on our website, where we have our blog, is to try and cover off the other ones there, rather than try and rush through a lot of them all. But a couple of others that have come up. One saying, a tenant's left a property without giving notice. What can I do? Et cetera, et cetera. Now, it sort of depends on how long is left on the agreement, to a certain degree, and you need to make reasonable efforts to reach out to them to see what's sort of going on, because arguably they are in an agreement with you. The other side is whether they've left the property, is whether they're still paying you rent for it. So it may be that they've had to sort of go overseas for work, for example. I'm just giving them the benefit of the doubt, but they're still paying the rent, which actually is the agreement. They haven't signed an agreement that they will reside at the property every single night. So question 1 is, are they still paying you the rent? If not, and they're sort of completely absconded, I would again pass this over to professionals to make sure you're being compliant and you're doing the things in a professional and proper and fit way. And you're welcome for me to answer more than that, because there are variables, obviously, in terms of what your actual sort of situation is. But it's an interesting one, and I think that probably sort of comes up sort of quite frequently. And then I suppose the other bit is just part of that question, actually, I guess, is that if there are rent arrears and tenants have absconded, and maybe you don't have a forwarding address, they've left the property, is if you've taken out rent guarantee insurance, what could I do as a landlord to recover the 3 months of lost rent that I may have? What is the situation there? Ben, I don't know if you want to make a start on that one, if I may.
Yeah, well, just to kind of take it from the sort of, perhaps an earlier stage in the process, what tends to happen with most kind of rent guarantees, with the pursuit of rent guarantee with most insurers, is normally the claim wouldn't necessarily be submitted to the insurer until between day 20 or 30 after the missed rent date. So what the process tends to be is about 7 days after the missed due date, the landlord should contact the tenant and sort of make it known that the rent is, and then leave it another week to sort of the 14-day period. And if that rent is still outstanding, they should contact the tenant again requesting payment. If that rent still isn't forthcoming by sort of day 20 to 30, no later than day 30, they should then submit a claim to their insurer. And then at around sort of day 32, about a month, but yeah, no later than day 32. Once that rent is overdue by 32 days, the insurer would then proceed with the claim, make a legal claim.
Great, fine, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I think that's all we've got time for this evening. I really appreciate everybody taking the trouble of tuning in and giving up their Wednesday evening for sort of 45 minutes or so. I hope that was really useful, and there was quite a lot of, I think, that we sort of covered off over the last 45 minutes, and then at least some of that you can put into play in your business of renting out properties. I would like to thank Ben from Simple Insurance for taking the trouble of joining us this evening, and everybody that's been listening from Simple Insurance, thank you very much as well. So very good evening to you, Ben, and thank you so much for agreeing to take part in this.
No problem. Thanks, guys.
And everybody from the RLA as well that has joined us, thank you very much as well. It's been a pleasure for hopefully educating you on some things that can help improve your business on a day-to-day basis. There will be an email that comes out shortly. So should you have missed some of this at the beginning because it took you a bit longer to get to your computer, you can re-listen again later on. There's a feedback form of other subject areas we can cover off in future, and I'm always sort of quite interested to know what else would be of interest to cover off, so I'd be really appreciative of any feedback there. And then just how you felt this evening went. What could we do to improve things? What worked well from your perspective? So I'd really appreciate any feedback you can do on that as well. And just thank you very much for taking the trouble of tuning in this evening. You know, we've all had a choice of what we wanted to do, and it's been an absolute pleasure. May I wish you all the very best for the rest of the day and the weekend. And Ben, thank you very much. Have a good evening. Take care. Bye.